Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla dünyayı Ekotürk ekranında buluşturuyoruz. Farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta Suriye'yi konuşacağız. Bilhassa ABD'nin Suriye politikasını konuşacağız. Oldukça önemli bir isimle ABD'nin Suriye'deki son büyükelçisi olan, özellikle Başkan Obama döneminde ülkenin Suriye politikasında etkili bir isim olarak görülen Robert Ford bizlerle. Kısa bir süre önce Obama'nın Suriye politikasına dair kapsamlı bir muhasebe yaptığı önemli bir yazısı yayınlandı. Ekrana da gelecek şimdi. Obama'nın Suriye'deki tereddüdü, hiç var olmamış kırmızı çizgi başlığını taşıyor yazı. Biraz da bu yazı üzerinden dünden bugüne ABD'nin Suriye politikasını değerlendireceğiz. Son bölgesel gelişmelere, Esad'la normalleşme süreçleri, Türkiye'nin tutumu, ABD'nin PYD, YPG desteği gibi başlıklara da değinerek. Welcome Mr. Ambassador, hoş geldiniz. Çok teşekkür ederim katıldığınız için.
Hoş bulduk, çok memnun oldum.
Ben de çok memnun oldum Sayın Büyükelçi. Well, Mr. Ambassador, your recent article about President Obama's famous red line, because his Syria policy and his decision not to intervene in Syria, basically his inaction in Syria, has long been criticized. The red line against the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons, especially in particular. So, the red line that never was. Why do you think this was a turning point? And is the Syrian mess Obama's legacy? What do you think?
I think first, Syria will always be a problem for Barack Obama's legacy. The red line decision, second thought, the red line decision will be part of that problematic legacy, especially because Obama first announced a red line and then he did not defend it. And the result was, I think, that Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government were more inclined than ever to avoid any political concession, to avoid any political compromise.
Mr. Ambassador, you say in the article that you urged Secretary of State John Kerry that time to support strikes for three reasons. Could you tell us more, and could you also tell us why it didn't work that time?
I think that we needed to do the strike for three reasons, really. The first is to defend an international consensus against the use of chemical weapons. My concern then, and still is, that another government fighting a serious opposition in a civil war situation might use chemical weapons in another instance, knowing that Bashar al-Assad in 2013. And of course, Assad continued to use chemical weapons later, according to the United Nations, and chemical weapons experts from The Hague, an organization in The Hague. Second reason, I think it was important that we do limited strikes, and I stress the word limited, in order to convince Assad that there was not a military victory possible for the Syrian government in 2013. To convince Assad that he would have to negotiate and would have to accept some political compromises in the negotiations with the Syrian opposition. Of course, history shows he accepted no compromise, and he did win, essentially, a military victory.
Yeah.
The third reason that I supported it was that I worried if the United States did nothing, that extremist groups in Syria, especially the al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front, would use the Western inaction as a recruitment tool to say to the young Syrians, the West will never help you, come join our jihad. And in fact, they did.
Mr. Ambassador, you say there are some lessons, especially two big lessons in your article to be drawn from the red line experience. And now coming back to also Biden's Syria policy, considering that there is no major change in U.S. Syria policy, what do you think about the lessons? And do you think U.S. took any lessons? And how do you see from Obama's term to Trump and then Biden's term now, how do you see, is there any major shift in US Syria policy, do you think, or there's no big change? What is your take on this?
Well, what I would say for Turkish viewers is that the American policy on Syria really has not changed very much since 2015. At the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, Barack Obama shifted away from focus on the Bashar al-Assad government and the Syrian civil war and focused narrowly on the problem of Daesh, the problem of the Islamic State. And that policy has continued since 2015 until today in 2023, the end of the Obama administration, throughout the Trump administration, and now in the Biden administration. There's American troops, American soldiers are in northeast Syria, but they are doing nothing with respect to Bashar al-Assad. They're still chasing little groups of ISIS fighters.
Just to come to this important critical topic, Mr. Ambassador, because in order to defeat Daesh, US has been supporting YPG, PYD, and this is the biggest, definitely the biggest challenge between Turkey and the US due to YPG's links with the PKK. Which is also, of course, recognized as a terrorist organization by the US. So this group has been praised as a great ally. I myself also personally heard several times in Washington, D.C., on several occasions, several panels, conferences, that they are seen as heroes. So let me ask you about this, let me call the term obsession. Why is this obsession? Is it just to defeat ISIS, or is it beyond that? Could you please tell us the US support, and do you think it will continue to be a major problem between Turkey-US relations?
I have many things I could say here, Faiza, but let me just start with two things. Number one, I do not think that Washington understands that this policy, this American support for the YPG and the PYD is the biggest problem between Ankara and Washington. And if Turkey thinks that it is the biggest problem, then my recommendation strongly to the Turkish authorities would be to emphasize that, because very frankly, in the American media and in American public statements about relations with Turkey, I hardly ever see the PYD and the YPG issue supported. Second point, I doubt very much that the United States will diminish its support for the YPG and the PYD in any foreseeable future. They were good fighters against ISIS, and I think we all should acknowledge that. They suffered a lot of casualties, and they were good, tough fighters. The Americans are grateful to them because of that. And as you probably saw during your own time in the United States, there is a lobby in Washington now supporting the PYD, and I should be frank with Turkish viewers, supporting the Kurdish drive for independence more broadly. There are academics, there are former American government officials who make statements about this. There are conferences at universities. The university where I taught, Yale, we had several conferences about this. So there is a lobby now in 2023 that did not exist 10 years ago.
What about the links, Mr. Ambassador, between PKK and PYD? Is there a consensus in Washington, D.C. that they are linked to each other, or they still reject the idea? What do you think about this argument that they're not linked to each other back in Washington, D.C.?
So initially in 2015, 2016, 2017, the officials in Washington tried to distinguish, to divide between the PKK and the PYD and the YPG. The last maybe 4 years, they stopped doing that. And now they admit that the links exist, but they do not believe that the PKK terrorism problem is so serious that it requires the Americans to avoid any relationship with the Syrian affiliate, the PYD and its YPG militia. So it won't change, Feyza.
What would be your recommendation, Mr. Ambassador, for both Washington and Ankara? Because Ankara obviously thinks that Washington is not taking its security concerns seriously, but Washington is seeing it in a different case, as you mentioned also. So what would be your advice on this very critical, very important topic for the relations?
Well, I have published articles, Feyza, here in the United States, urging the Americans to stop supporting the PYD and the YPG, and instead to work with the Turkish government to ensure that extremists from northern Syria cannot cross the Turkish border and then go on to Europe and North America. That requires changes in the way Turkey administers its border in Syria, but I think that is ultimately the best solution to contain the remaining ISIS problem. I would offer some advice to officials in Turkey. As I said, they need to highlight this issue if it is, in fact, the biggest Turkish complaint about Washington. And I have a second bit of advice, which is that if they see that there are instances of YPG fighters in Syria involved in attacks inside Turkey, they need to highlight those attacks and provide evidence to American officials.
Do you think this will change the mood in Washington, D.C.? The sentiment?
Not in one day, but over a space of time. I think that would be a more effective way for Turkey to present its viewpoint to the Americans. But I stress the need for evidence. That would be the most important thing in the eyes of officials in Washington.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Ambassador. Go ahead, please.
No, please.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, I also want to ask you about your opinion about the rapprochement, normalization process with the Assad regime now, also Turkey and between Turkey and Syria. What do you think now Assad is back to the Arab fold again? He's been welcomed in the Arab League again, and the US is not very happy about the process, but they don't oppose the process either. How do you think this normalization process will change the course of the war in Syria, and especially also between Turkey, Syria, Iran, Russia? How do you see the future of relations?
First, let me just say something brief about the normalization between Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia and the Assad government. I think it gives Assad a small political boost. It helps him a little politically, but I think most Syrians living in Syria either don't care because their lives are difficult. It's hard to buy food in the winter. It's hard to buy fuel. It's hard to buy gasoline year-round. The lives of regular Syrians in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, in Hama are very difficult. And I don't think those Syrian civilians care very much about the normalization with Arab countries unless there is reconstruction money coming from Saudi Arabia, coming from Abu Dhabi, coming from Kuwait. And there, the American policy of sanctions is going to delay, if not cancel, much of the financial assistance which Arab states otherwise might provide to the Assad government. So I think the normalization impact is limited. I would be happy to discuss my view on the Turkish normalization, if that's useful, Feyza.
Please, we have a few minutes left, Mr. Ambassador, so please share us your valuable insights on the normalization process.
I would just, I read with great attention what the previous defense minister in Turkey, Mr. Akar, said, and it made sense to me that Turkey understands that the Syrian army is too weak to provide security for Turkey along the Turkish-Syrian border against PKK terrorists, and that therefore it is very difficult for Turkey to withdraw its forces and depend only on the Syrian army to provide security there. And I think until the Syrian army's capabilities are greater, this will be a challenge for the Turkish government.
And unless Turkey's presence does not end in Syria, Syrian regime, Assad regime, is not accepting, normalizing. So do you think it's going to be it's going to stay as a deadlock in the near future?
Yes, yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. And how is
exactly.
How is the U.S. approach here, and or how should its approach, do you think, to this process, especially with Russia and Iran more involved in the process?
Yeah, I think from the American point of view, normalization with the Assad government is not desired because they do not want Assad to gain politically, not with Saudi Arabia, not with Turkey, not with Kuwait, not with Abu Dhabi, none of them. But the Americans don't have a plan for Syria. And I should say that again. The Americans do not have a plan for Syria. They will just continue doing the same as they do now, as far as we can see. I think the Americans are not happy about Iranian influence in Syria, but they really cannot do very much about it. And Israeli airstrikes, therefore, from the American point of view, are very useful.
Did they ever have a plan, Mr. Ambassador, in especially in the last 12 years?
No, it's a fair question. And what I would say, Feyza, is we had a plan to pursue a negotiation under a United Nations framework in 2011 and 2012. But the plan was impossible to achieve without real pressure, military pressure, on the Assad government. Without military pressure, Assad makes no concessions. Mm-hmm. And it was never the intention of the Obama administration to put serious military pressure on the Assad government. And that is, in fact, why I resigned in early 2014. Mm-hmm. If there is a large attack that kills many American soldiers in eastern Syria, then perhaps an American administration, Democratic or Republican, might consider withdrawing American forces. But otherwise, the Americans will stay. And I think Turkey, as we just discussed, also has its challenges in terms of withdrawing and what would provide security along that border.
Mm-hmm. So you don't expect American presence to fully end in Syria, Mr. Ambassador?
Not unless there is some kind of incident in which there are large numbers of American fatalities. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If one American is killed here and one American is killed there, politically in Washington, it is possible to stay in Syria for a very, very long time.
I see. Thank you very much. Çok teşekkür ederim Sayın Büyükelçi katıldığınız için.
Rica ederim.
Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta ABD'nin Suriye'deki son büyükelçisini ağırladık. ABD'nin Suriye politikasını konuştuk. Böyle bir politikası varsa eğer bunu anlamaya çalıştık. Robert Ford bizlerleydi. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşçakalın.